A gallon of gas cost about $1.50 back in 1995. That same gallon runs over $3 today. Milk sat at $2.48 a gallon and now it's crossed $4. A movie ticket went for $5.39 and that same seat costs almost $12 right now. None of those things improved. Gas burns the same way it always has. Milk still spoils in a week, and the theater seat hasn't changed at all. What changed is that your dollar got weaker, and that weakening has a name: inflation. This is the single most important financial concept that almost nobody actually understands. The word shows up constantly in headlines and conversations, but most people couldn't explain what causes it or why it's been quietly pulling money out of their pocket every single day. Today we're going to fix that. By the end of this video, you'll understand inflation better than most adults in this country, and you'll see exactly why letting your money sit still is the one thing you cannot afford to do. We'll start with the simplest possible definition. Inflation is the general increase in the prices of goods and services over time, and that's really all it is. One product getting more expensive because of a hurricane doesn't qualify. Inflation means basically everything costs more than it used to, which means each dollar you hold buys less than it did before. The Federal Reserve puts it plainly, calling it the increase in the prices of goods and services over time, and they're very specific that it has to be a general increase across the economy, not just one product or one category. The International Monetary Fund frames it more bluntly, saying the single biggest cost of inflation is the erosion of real income. Your paycheck might look the same on paper, but it doesn't stretch as far. Now let me make this concrete because the numbers get wild when you actually lay them out. These come from federal data, Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census Bureau figures, spanning 3 full decades. $123,900 bought you the median new home in the United States in 1990. That number climbed to $165,000 by 2000, reached $222,000 by 2010, and landed at $419,300 by the end of 2024. That same median American home now costs almost 3.5 times what it did 34 years ago. Whole milk tells a similar story, moving from about $2 a gallon in 1990 to $2.78 in 2000 up to $3.26 in 2010 and just under $4 in 2024. As of 2026, that gallon has crossed $4.14. Gas tracked a parallel path, going from about $1.30 in 1990 to $1.51 in 2000, jumping to $2.78 in 2010, and settling at $3.30 in 2024. Movie tickets ran $4.22 in 1990, $5.39 in 2000, $7.89 in 2010, and $11.51 in 2024. Here's what stands out when you look at all of that together. Nothing on the list tripled in quality. Milk didn't become 3 times more nutritious, and the house didn't grow 3 times bigger. Your dollar just lost that much purchasing power over 34 years. And that's not a bug, it's by design. We'll get to why in a minute. If prices keep climbing year after year, somebody has to keep track, and the tool for doing that is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes it monthly as part of the U.S. Department of Labor, and the data stretches back to 1913, giving us over 100 years of price records. The way it works is that the BLS builds a giant basket of goods and services representing what a typical American household buys, then tracks prices across more than 200 categories collected from about 23,000 retail and service locations in 75 cities. Rent data comes from surveys of roughly 50,000 landlords and tenants, and the weights for the basket itself come from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, where about 20,000 households report their spending every quarter. The basket isn't weighted equally, and the breakdown matters. Housing dominates at 44% of the index, with shelter alone, meaning rent and ownership costs, accounting for about 35.5%. Transportation makes up almost 17%, food and beverages sit at about 14.5%, and medical care covers around 8%, with the remainder spread across education, recreation, apparel, and other services. When the news reports that inflation came in at 3.8% last month, what they're really telling you is that the entire basket, weighted toward whatever Americans spend the most on, climbed 3.8% compared to the same month a year earlier. One quick distinction worth knowing. CPI is the headline number, but the Federal Reserve actually targets a different measure called PCE. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Index published by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. PCE gets calculated a little differently and tends to run slightly lower, and the Fed's official target sits at 2% PCE inflation. For everyday conversation and news coverage, CPI remains the number that matters. Now that we know what inflation is and how it gets measured, the big question becomes what actually causes it. Economists point to three main drivers, and I'll explain each one without any jargon. The first goes by the name demand pull inflation, and it works like this. When a lot of people have a lot of money, and they all want to buy things at the same time, but there isn't enough supply to go around, sellers raise prices. Too much money chasing too few goods. The IMF describes it as what happens when demand exceeds an economy's production capacity, and we watched a textbook case of this unfold after the pandemic. Across 3 rounds, the U.S. government sent direct stimulus payments of up to $3,200 per adult, all while factories sat shut down and supply chains remained broken. That meant a surge of spending power slammed into an economy that couldn't produce enough to meet it, and prices climbed. The second driver is cost-push inflation, which runs in the opposite direction. Instead of excess demand pulling prices up, the cost of producing things rises and companies pass those higher costs on to you. The textbook example here happened on October 19, 1973, when Arab oil-producing nations imposed an export embargo on the United States following the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled from $2.90 a barrel to $11.65 by January 1974. And since oil feeds into practically everything, transportation, manufacturing, heating, the shock rippled across the entire economy. CPI inflation reached about 11% in 1974. The third driver ties to monetary policy, specifically the money supply, and this one sparks the most debate. The core idea remains simple. When a government or central bank floods the economy with new money while the supply of goods and services stays the same, each dollar becomes worth less. Milton Friedman captured it in one famous line, calling inflation always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. That dynamic played out dramatically during 2020 and 2021. The M2 money supply, which covers all cash, checking deposits, and easily accessible savings in the economy, grew by about 40% in just 2 years, jumping from roughly $15.5 trillion in February 2020 to about $21.7 trillion by April 2022. That pace of money supply growth had never been recorded before. About 18 months later, inflation peaked, exactly the kind of lag Friedman would have predicted. In the real world, all three drivers tend to overlap. And that's precisely what happened in 2021 and 2022. Massive demand fueled by stimulus checks collided with cost-push pressure from broken supply chains and energy disruptions, all layered on top of an enormous expansion of the money supply. Every condition aligned at once. That brings us to the question a lot of you probably came here with, which is what exactly happened with inflation recently and why everything suddenly got so expensive. The sequence started with the pandemic response. Roughly $5 trillion in total fiscal stimulus moved through the U.S. economy across 3 waves. The CARES Act in March 2020 accounted for $2.2 trillion. Another $900 billion followed in December 2020, and the American Rescue Plan added $1.9 trillion more in March 2021. Direct payments went out, enhanced unemployment kicked in, and small business loans started flowing. Supply chains collapsed at the same time. Semiconductor shortages pushed the used vehicle price index up 41% year over year. Port congestion at Los Angeles and Long Beach hit record levels, and about 4.5 million Americans quit their jobs in a single month, November 2021, which made the labor shortage even worse. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 piled on further pressure. Brent crude oil topped $130 a barrel in March, and because Russia and Ukraine together supplied about 30% of global wheat exports, food prices spiked worldwide. All of that converged into one number, 9.1%. That was the headline CPI reading for June 2022, the largest 12-month increase since November 1981. Energy had climbed almost 42%. Gasoline specifically had surged nearly 60%, and food had risen over 10%. Core CPI, which strips out food and energy, reached 6.6% by September 2022, the highest reading since 1982. Gas hit about $5.15 a gallon nationally, and people felt the squeeze everywhere, in grocery bills, rent, car payments, all of it. The Federal Reserve responded with historically aggressive rate hikes, raising the federal funds rate 11 times over 16 months for a total of 525 basis points, or 5.25 percentage points. The target range went from near zero to 5.25 to 5.5% by July 2023, the highest level since 2001, making it the fastest tightening cycle since the early 1980s. That campaign worked, but slowly. CPI fell to about 2.9% by the end of 2024, and the Fed began cutting rates in September 2024, bringing the target range down to 3.5% to 3.75% by May 2026. Here's the part most people miss, though. Prices didn't come back down. That 9.1% spike never reversed. When you hear that inflation dropped to 3 or 4%, that doesn't mean prices fell. It means they're still going up, just at a slower pace. The damage from that spike is permanent, and everything simply costs more now. Lower inflation does not mean lower prices. It means prices are rising slower, and that distinction is one of the most misunderstood things about how inflation works. Now we get to the part that hits your bank account directly, and honestly, this section should make you a little angry, because the math is brutal. Picture $10,000 sitting in a regular savings account at a big bank. Most major banks pay 0.01% APY on their standard savings, which means after 10 years at that rate, your $10,000 earns a grand total of $10 in interest, leaving you with $10,010. Over those same 10 years, if inflation averages 3% per year, which tracks right around the long-term U.S. average, the real purchasing power of that money drops hard. Your $10,010 will only buy what roughly $7,450 buys today. $2,500 in purchasing power, gone, which is a 25% real loss, and you didn't spend a single dime. The money just sat there and shrank. Right now, the national average savings account rate, according to the FDIC, sits at 0.38%, which is nowhere near the current inflation rate of 3.8%. Even the best high-yield savings accounts paying around 4 to 4.1% are barely matching inflation, barely breaking even. Ronald Reagan once called inflation as violent as a mugger, as frightening as an armed robber, and as deadly as a hitman, and that comparison holds up because it takes your money without you ever seeing it happen. John Maynard Keynes, one of the most influential economists in history, wrote in 1919 that through a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. He wrote those words over 100 years ago, and that is still exactly how it works today. Most people assume the goal should be zero inflation. If rising prices eat away at purchasing power, just keep prices perfectly stable and the problem goes away. The reality is that a small, steady amount of inflation is considered healthy for the economy, and the alternative, deflation, where prices actually fall, is considered far more dangerous. The Federal Reserve officially targets 2% annual inflation, reaffirming that number as recently as August 2025, and there's real logic behind the choice. A little inflation gives the Fed room to maneuver during a downturn. When the economy slides into a recession, the standard response is to cut interest rates to stimulate activity, but if inflation already sits at zero and rates are already low, there's nowhere to cut. Economists call that the zero lower bound, and a 2% inflation cushion keeps that tool available. Moderate inflation also motivates people to spend and invest rather than hoard cash. Because if your money loses a little value every year just sitting idle, you're pushed toward putting it to work, which keeps money circulating through the economy. On top of that, mild inflation makes it easier for wages to adjust, since companies can give smaller raises during tough stretches without technically cutting anyone's pay, letting inflation do the adjusting instead. Japan serves as the cautionary tale for what happens when prices go the other direction. After their asset bubble burst in the early 1990s, the country entered a period known as the lost decades. Real GDP growth collapsed from about 4% a year in the 80s down to roughly 1% annually between 1991 and 2003, and inflation turned negative during the 2000s. The Nikkei stock index captured the damage visually, falling from a peak of nearly 39,000 in December 1989 to a low of about 7,000 in 2009, an 80+% collapse over 2 decades. The mechanism behind all of that destruction is straightforward. When prices keep falling, consumers delay purchases because they expect things to be cheaper tomorrow. And the IMF explains that this leads to less economic activity, less income generated by producers, and lower economic growth. Less spending triggers lower revenue, which triggers layoffs, which triggers even less spending, and the cycle feeds on itself. Japan stayed trapped in that spiral for decades, and that experience is exactly why every major central bank in the world, including the Fed, aims for a small positive number rather than zero. Before we wrap up, let's put all of this in the context of your paycheck. Because even if you understand everything we've covered, the question most people carry around is whether they're actually falling behind. For most of recent history, the answer has been yes. A Pew Research Center analysis found that as of 2018, the average hourly wage for American workers had roughly the same purchasing power it carried 40 years earlier. 4 decades passed, and the average worker's dollar stretched about the same distance, and whatever gains did show up mostly flowed to the highest paid tier of workers. The 2021 to 2023 spike made it worse. Real average hourly earnings, meaning pay adjusted for inflation, fell 1.7% between December 2021 and December 2022, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Real weekly earnings were still dropping as of April 2023, down 1.1%. Real wages finally started growing again by 2024 and 2025, with about a 1.2% year-over-year gain by mid-2025, but that came after years of lost ground. And then there's the stat that always lands hard: $7.25 per hour. That's the federal minimum wage, unchanged since July 2009, the longest stretch without a federal increase in the history of the minimum wage law. The minimum wage reached its highest purchasing power in 1968 at $1.60 per hour, which adjusts to roughly $13 to $15 in today's money. A minimum wage worker in 1968 could buy almost twice as much with their paycheck as a minimum wage worker earns the right to buy today. That's not a political statement, it's just the math. That is inflation doing its work over 50+ years. Let's bring everything together. Inflation is not some abstract economic concept floating in a textbook. It is the silent, constant force making your money worth less every single day. At 3% per year, which is roughly the long-term average, your purchasing power gets cut in half in about 24 years. At the recent rate of 3.8%, that timeline shrinks even further. If your money isn't growing at least as fast as inflation, you are losing purchasing power, and not slowly either. The loss runs about 25% per decade. This is the part I really want you to walk away with. Inflation is the reason investing exists. Not greed, not get-rich-quick schemes, just the basic need to outrun an invisible tax that never stops. A savings account paying 0.01% doesn't outrun it, and even the best high-yield savings accounts paying 4% are treading water at best. The specific strategies for outrunning inflation, index funds, retirement accounts, all of that, those topics have their own dedicated videos coming on this channel. Understanding inflation comes first, because until you recognize that doing nothing with your money isn't playing it safe, that it's actually guaranteeing you lose, none of those strategies will make sense. And now you understand it. If something clicked today that didn't make sense before, hit subscribe, because we break down every one of these financial concepts the same way. Clear, no jargon, just the information you actually need. I'll see you in the next one.